A car speeds through the darkening streets of Barcelona. In the backseat, a nervous man rushes toward the airport. He already knows police have come for his closest allies, and he's next. But the escape doesn't work out. The former president of FC Barcelona is arrested on multiple serious charges. As investigations and lawsuits unfold, Josep Bartomeu is torn apart by the press, the fans, and the entire football world. Perhaps the most corrupt official in Barca's history will also be named the main culprit of the club's precipitous fall into the depths of the most significant financial crisis in football history. However, today I will prove to you that this certainly unscrupulous football functionary is just a cog in the whole system, which in the current football realities would eventually have led Barcelona to this fall anyway. Together, we'll dive as deeply as possible into the political, economic, managerial, and, of course, the football dimensions of one of the most iconic football brands on the planet. A club so powerful that even after everything it has been through, it's beginning to rise again. And maybe, just maybe, one day we'll look back on this dark chapter as the true beginning of a great new era. Let's rewind to the summer of 2003, when Barcelona was gearing up for the election of a new president. One of these 6 candidates will replace one of the worst presidents in the club's history, the guy who took Barca from the top to being just a mid-table team. Joan Gaspart spent more than 20 years as vice president of Josep Luis Núñez, under whom Blaugranas turned from a small-town club into a global brand in the 80s. The emperor was a pragmatic and tough businessman with a background in construction, so it's not surprising that at first he relied on infrastructure development, the expansion of the Camp Nou, the construction of stadiums for reserve and youth teams, and of course the opening of La Masia in '79. Nevertheless, the matter was not limited to infrastructure projects. The club closed all debts incurred for the construction of the Camp Nou, put its finances in order, created a strong management team, and began to develop rapidly, inviting world stars and starting to win European trophies. However, over time, Núñez's approach to club management began to cause increasing discontent among the fans. They believed that he was blurring the national identity of Barcelona, which has always been not just a football team, but a symbol of Catalonia, its culture, language, and long-term struggle for autonomy and self-determination. For many fans, the club represented resistance to the centralized power of Madrid. What's also important to understand here is how much Barcelona fans could actually shape the club's future. The membership system was set up at the beginning of the 20th century by Joan Camper, the club's founder, who wanted to strengthen the bond between the club and its supporters, making them active participants in Barcelona's life. While many clubs in Spain and Portugal had a similar setup, Barca took it to another level, becoming the first club to reach 10,000 socios in 1922 and smashing through the 100,000 mark in the early 80s. In the first half of the 20th century, regular members had limited influence in the club's decisions. Big choices were still made by a small group of club officials and some powerful socios. However, the fall of the Franco regime and Spain's transition to democracy in the 70s marked the beginning of a new era in club governance based on the principles of democratic participation and transparency. Barcelona began to elect presidents by voting all club members, not just the authority socios. So in '78, Núñez became the first truly democratically elected president. Such a management model has both a number of significant advantages and certainly serious downsides. Well, for example, fans can be sure that no one will buy their native and beloved club with borrowed funds, then hang all this debt on the club, then turn it into a real supermarket and siphon hundreds of millions from it. In the process, also selling pieces of the club to other investors for much more serious money. Oh yeah, the club will totally fall apart on the field, swapping coaches left and right, messing with lineups, and eventually going from being top tier to just another average team. However, where the advantage of such a management model lies, its main disadvantages also exist. For example, during a deep crisis, crisis, the club simply cannot attract large investments, which, by the way, can eventually save it by selling part of the shares to new investors. Instead, the only way out is to go even deeper into debt. And let's be real, this system might look like a democracy, but in reality, the main decisions are still made by a small group of people who aren't exactly average fans. But I won't spoil it too much. Let's rewind back to the 20th century. Fans' dissatisfaction with Nunes' chosen course led to the appearance of the Blaugrana Manifest, in which a group of influential club members, Catalan intellectuals, and several notable former players put forward a number of demands to the leadership. Moreover, this manifest laid the foundation for the emergence of the Elephant Blau Party, which was opposed to the leadership, the backbone of which was made up of young and enterprising Catalans from the world of business and finance, led by young and ambitious lawyer Joan Laporta, who charmed everyone around him with his outstanding speaking skills. Thanks to its radical opposition rhetoric, Elephant Blau was rapidly gaining popularity among the socios, and they weren't afraid to use some pretty questionable tactics. High-ranking members of Elephant Blau spread rumors that Nunes planned to change the club's ownership, transforming it into a joint stock company, selling off shares, and eliminating the fan membership system. In reality, though, Nunes did the opposite. When Spain's laws changed, he established a special reserve fund for the club to serve as a financial safety net during tough times. Nevertheless, Elephant Blau used their levers of influence to pass a vote of no confidence in the president based on this blatant misinformation. Even though they had strong support, including from the legendary Johan Cruyff, who Nunes had fired as coach the year before, the rebellion didn't succeed. About two-thirds of the club members, mostly from the more conservative part of the fans, backed the current president. However, the emperor knew things weren't looking great. After being in charge for 2 decades, he saw the storm clouds gathering. On top of a fair amount of opposition, the club was struggling on the field and having issues with players and coaches. Meanwhile, the opposition continues to attract more and more influential and anti-Nunes figures to its side. So to hold on to power, he needed to make a smart move. A year before his term was up, just when Elephant Blau started making noise about the club's rising debt, Nunes announced that he'd done enough for Barcelona and it was time for new blood. He resigned and called for early elections for a new president. He threw his support behind his longtime vice president, Joan Gaspar, who was super popular with the fans and was supposed to carry on Nunes' vision. The opposition wasn't ready for such an abrupt turn of events, and as a result, they ran a weak election campaign, putting up a feeble candidate against the ruling party's candidate. However, Gaspar, who won the election, essentially betrayed his patron by going down his own path, and it almost led the club, and him personally, to disaster just a couple of years later. A few days after he took over, Barcelona lost the best player on the planet, who moved to their biggest rivals. In just 3 seasons, Gaspar spent an insane amount of money, and things went downhill fast. The club changed 3 coaches, got buried in debt, and stopped competing for the title. The president got attacked by fans a few times, but the final straw was when the entire Camp Nou waved goodbye with white handkerchiefs. So, just like Nunes before him, Gaspar resigned before his term ended. Barcelona had to hold early elections again, but this time, even the most conservative socios agreed the club needed change and fresh blood. The election battle was mostly between opposition candidates from different parties, but Bassat lost once again. And that's when 39-year-old Joan Laporta stepped in as president, and with him, maybe the most exciting chapter in the history of Catalan football. December 19, 2009, Barcelona became the first club in football history to win all 6 tournaments they participated in during a calendar year. In the Champions League final, Barca took the field with 7 players and a coach who were all products of La Masia. Just a year later, La Masia became the first football academy to have 3 of its students nominated as finalists for the Ballon d'Or. Yep, this was probably the peak of Catalan football's success. And the main beneficiary of the academy's work was the man who overthrew the founder of this academy. Such are the vicissitudes of fate. Having taken office, the young, energetic Laporta first began to clean up Gaspar's legacy, and he didn't just focus on football. One of his first moves was to ban the radical fan group Boixas Noise. It was a smart move to reduce the overall toxicity around the club, but it also meant Laporta went against his old allies, who had been used by the opposition to discredit Gaspar and attack the ruling party. Don't take it personally, lads. It's just politics. Next up was a massive audit of the club's finances. It turned out that under Gaspar's presidency, Barca's total debt had skyrocketed to nearly 200 million euros. Literally nothing compared to what Laporta will face 17 years later. On top of that, Barca wasn't earning much at all. The club wasn't even in the top 10 for annual revenue and was making only half of what Real Madrid was pulling in. So the new management had to build a commercial department that could match the club's ambitions. And spoiler alert, they did it so well that within 10 years, Barca went from 13th place to the #1 spot among Europe's highest earning clubs. But of course, this leap forward was also heavily influenced by what was happening on the field, and that came from a series of brilliant decisions made by the club's management. Laporta had a real knack for negotiations and handling his players, huge signings, smart transfers, and promoting talent straight from La Masia. During Laporta's first term, it seemed like Barcelona couldn't make a wrong move when it came to player development. But maybe the biggest win happened on July 1st, 2008. By that time, Barcelona had fully regained its place among the elite, winning the Spanish titles again and securing their second ever Champions League trophy. Off the back of this success, Laporta was re-elected for a second term, and he didn't even have to campaign. Other candidates couldn't even get enough signatures from the socios to run. But even with all this success and popularity, Laporta managed to make a few enemies. Surprisingly, from his own inner circle. Sandro Rosell and Josep Bartomeu were both part of Elephant Blau, supported Laporta's presidential campaign, and eventually got prominent roles in his team. Rosell was closely aligned with Laporta, but as the club began to rebuild, tensions started to rise between them. The head of the club, who was always in the spotlight, took charge of most decisions and sometimes acted with the same authority as the former president. Rosell, who had a hand in many of Barcelona's big deals during this time, felt left out and started to resent Laporta's success, thinking it was a team effort. On top of that, he wasn't too happy about Johan Cruyff's considerable influence on his friend, which made Rosell feel like a bit of a puppet as vice president. Meanwhile, Bartomeu was frustrated with the lack of attention to Barcelona's basketball and handball teams, which he led. Anyway, two of Laporta's top executives left the club before his first term ended, but Rosell was sure he'd be back and was waiting for his moment. That moment came in 2008, just a week after Pep returned to Catalonia. Barcelona had a rough 2007-08 season. They finished 18 points behind Real and stopped one step away from the Champions League final. The club finished without trophies for the second consecutive season, which was considered a failure. Laporta dismissed Frank Rijkaard and brought in Pep, but that wasn't enough for the opposition socios, who was secretly backed and directed by Rosell. 3 weeks before the start of the new season, which Laporta announced as a new chapter in the club's history, he was given a vote of no confidence, motivated not only by unsuccessful results, but also by a departure from his original principles of transparency and teamwork. The vote started, and even though it didn't get enough support to force Laporta out, the majority still voted against him. The reaction was immediate. The enraged president dismissed most of the governing council, accusing them of rebellion and having ties to Rosell. However, now, after such disappointing voting results, Laporta simply has no right to make a mistake. Next time, he will not be able to retain power. He has to improve the team's performance on the field fast, so his enemies can't use it against him anymore. So the bet on Pep, which the president made even before the story of the vote of no confidence, becomes an all-in bet. And you already know exactly what happened next. After 2 decades under Núñez, the club updated its charter. The new rules said that a president could only serve 2 consecutive terms. So in 2010, Catalonia faced new elections, and fans were worried that Barcelona wouldn't find the right candidate. Laporta's secret was that he skillfully combined high ambitions and pragmatism, and only by balancing these 2 components could a big club like Barcelona achieve success with such a management model. However, the next president didn't maintain that balance, and that ultimately led to Barcelona's downfall. Sandro Rosell didn't just ditch the principle of balance. He completely changed the club's strategy and philosophy, even while Guardiola's team was still on fire, playing some truly magical football. Rosell ran his election campaign with the slogan "Tots som el Barça," which promised numerous vital changes that made the socios feel optimistic about the future. As a result, Rosell won the election by a record margin in Barca's history. However, as soon as the new president entered his office, he made a move completely contrary to his declared values. First of all, he changed the club's charter and increased the presidential term to 6 years. Then, instead of sticking to Barcelona's Catalan traditions, Rosell became an innovator. Since its founding, Barcelona has never had a title sponsor on its shirt. You might say, but wait, during Laporta's second term, Barca had the UNICEF logo on their chests. True, but that wasn't about making money. It was a charity deal where Barca actually donated 1.5 million euros a year. But Rosell broke more than a century-old tradition of the club by signing the largest sponsorship contract in football at that time. And if we put aside the massive contradiction to the principles he campaigned on, this decision actually made sense. Under Laporta, the club's revenues more than doubled. However, with the changing landscape of European football in the early 2010s and the rise of clubs backed by wealthy states, Barcelona was quickly falling behind. In a situation like this, refusing to go for a title sponsor wouldn't just be short-sighted. It'd be plain stupid if you really wanted to stay competitive at the highest level. 6 months after the sponsor scandal, Rosell managed to calm things down a bit and ease the fans' frustration by signing Fabregas. After 8 years, Cesc finally came back home to Catalonia. Along with another Champions League win, this really boosted Rosell's credibility, which allowed Sandro to continue his course towards commercializing the club. However, the following season, the president had to delve deeply into the football side of things as Barcelona lost Guardiola and entered a period of turbulence. And this is where things take a turn, an event that triggered a series of disastrous consequences, not just for Barcelona, but for football around the world. Barca won the fierce battle for Neymar primarily due to close personal contact with the player's father. Before joining Laporta's team in 2002, Rosell worked as a top manager at Nike in Brazil, where he established connections with numerous Brazilian athletes, their agents, and entourages. It was these connections that helped Barcelona win the race for Ronaldinho over Manchester United, so Rosell had to tap into his Brazilian network again. But here's the catch. While Barca's move for Ronaldinho was completely legal, and the transfer happened thanks to personal connections, this time the club got caught up in a real criminal scheme. According to Barcelona's official stance, Neymar's transfer cost the club 57 million euros, but in reality, most of that money went straight into the Brazilian's pocket. In addition to Santos, 2 investment firms also held stakes in Neymar's economic rights. This is actually a pretty common practice in Latin America, where struggling clubs sell part of a player's future transfer rights to third parties. However, just a few years after this scandalous deal, FIFA shut down this kind of deal for investors. Coincidence? Barcelona claimed they paid 57 million euros, but officially, only a third of that amount was transferred to Santos. The rest was wired to N&N, Neymar Sr.'s company. Yep, his dad got the lion's share. This payment can be considered as a signing bonus. However, we all understand that the clubs and the player colluded to reduce the payments owed to to investors. Well, Santos subsequently received additional hidden payments through a series of parallel agreements in which these two companies were no longer taken into account. Additionally, all parties involved in the deal were able to save a significant amount of money by circumventing tax laws. But they didn't realize just how big the scandal would get. This lack of foresight cost Rosell his presidency 6 months after Neymar's transfer. Against the backdrop of the ongoing investigation and under public pressure, he still gave up and resigned. And who steps in to take over this mess? Josep Bartomeu, another familiar face of our story, had been working under Rosell as vice president for the past 3 years. Being a skilled politician, Bartomeu didn't just step in as acting president until the 2016 elections, as expected. Instead, he announced that elections would be held a year earlier. This happened during Barcelona's second most successful season ever, when the MSN trio was destroying every opponent in sight. During the campaign, the opposition's accusations of corruption were drowned out by all the big wins. At the end of the season, Bartomeu officially became president, defeating his rivals in the elections. And at this point, Barcelona began its sharp fall. Like his two predecessors, Bartomeu kicked off his presidency with a series of smart team management moves. One key move was bringing Luis Enrique back to Catalonia, which laid the foundation for the treble in his first season. But after that, Josep really slowed down his success, because then it's time for a grand shopping experience. It's not worth listing every single transfer and failure Bartomeu had over those 2.5 years, leading up to the historic 2017 summer transfer window. Respect to Rosell, though. He brought back Cesc and Alba, and even with the push towards commercialization, he still promoted young talent from La Masia, even if the new breed didn't match the previous star generation in terms of talent level. Under Bartomeu, Barca completely turned its back on academy players and focused on shopping. Someone might argue that after a few strong generations of homegrown talent, La Masia went through a period of stagnation, and it took time to overcome it. But the reality turned out to be much more ordinary. Turns out, Bartomeu built a whole business system around his relationships with agents, which is why there was no focus on academy players. Why bring in a homegrown talent when you personally can't make money off their transfer? Following the end of Josep's presidency, the audit revealed that during his tenure, commission payments to third parties on many transfers had increased from Barcelona's traditional 5% to nearly a third of the total transfer fees. And then came the historic summer of 2017. After 4 years, Neymar still couldn't escape Messi's shadow. On top of that, he had issues with the Spanish tax authorities, a contract dispute with Barcelona, and of course, PSG was ready to pay the record-breaking release clause. And you know, this deal will forever remain in football history, not just because it is a record transfer. Given the current crazy market, it's only a matter of time before it gets surpassed. This deal is forever in history because all three sides won at the entrance, but ultimately lost at the exit. PSG still hasn't won the Champions League, and they ended up with an injury-prone, high-maintenance player, each match costing them over 4 million euros. Neymar didn't just fail to escape Messi's shadow. With all his injuries, he quickly started to decline in a much weaker league. But the worst luck was with Barca, who received the record-breaking money. Check this out. First, the management needed to quickly find a direct replacement for Neymar in terms of position on the left wing. Bartomeu had 5 options on the table, but Mbappe and Dembele were at the top of the shortlist. So those were the guys Barcelona started negotiating with. And how could our visionary hero mess this up, right? Although let's be honest, several factors simply coincided here, including an incorrect assessment of Dembele's potential, his character, and his role in the game, where Barca was looking for a winger rather than a shifting inside center like Mbappe. Plus, some Catalan analysts believed that bringing in Mbappe might disrupt the locker room balance and negatively impact Messi's position and mood. So at the end of August, with the clock ticking, Bartomeu took a trip to Monte Carlo, where Borussia's reps were waiting for him to wrap up the final round of talks for Dembele. Before boarding the plane, Josep told himself that 80 million euros would be his absolute limit. However, the Barca president would leave Monte Carlo the next morning with a preliminary agreement for nearly 150 million euros. The way the Germans handled this deal, it seriously belongs in a negotiation textbook. They knew PSG had just blown up the market. They knew Barca had Neymar money burning a hole in their pocket, and they knew the clock was ticking. Dortmund played it perfectly. For weeks, they kept rejecting Barca's offers, dragging things out, raising the price, all while keeping Usman hyped and ready to move. He kept pushing from his side, and just as the window was about to slam shut, they called that final meeting, then jacked the price to the max. Bartomeu had no other choice. He folded, and then 6 months later, Liverpool pulled the same move. They watched how it worked and forced Barca to break the transfer record again, 2 windows in a row. Dembele's case might have just been bad luck. Maybe things would have been different without all those injuries. But Coutinho? That was a mess from day one. They brought him in to be Iniesta's replacement, then stuck him out wide like a winger. It never made sense. And it went downhill fast, but that wasn't enough for the Barca board. In the next 2 seasons, the Catalans continued to be the most wasteful player on the transfer market. In the summer of 19, when the Blue Garnet admitted a mistake and released Coutinho to Munich, who literally 6 months later would participate in the most grandiose humiliation of Barca, they again spent a record amount per window. This time, the big-ticket signing was Antoine Griezmann. Barca paid his full release clause, got a top striker, and weakened one of their La Liga rivals. On paper, it looked solid, but once again, it was a player who didn't fit the system. Griezmann struggled to find his place in the attack, and on top of that, he never really clicked in the locker room. As a result, the Frenchman found himself at odds with Barcelona's demands, which did not align with his strengths. However, things become even more intriguing when you examine how the transfer was handled behind the scenes. According to Spanish rules, release clauses must be paid in full up front, no installments, no delays. So on July 11th, all the contracts were signed, everything was ready. But later that night, the Barca execs realized they didn't have enough cash on hand to actually pay for it. They scrambled, trying to find tens of millions overnight. And this is not a microloan for you the day before your salary arrives. Here we were talking about tens of millions, which were eventually borrowed at an increased interest rate in a hurry and with a lot of fuss. In the end, Barcelona did not even recoup 100 million euros from its 3 record transfer entries. In total, under Bartomeu, from the 14th to the 19th year, the club spent more than 1 billion euros on transfers. However, the damage wasn't just from buying badly. Irrational decisions were also made regarding contract extensions, salary levels, and of course, sales. Especially the sales of unclaimed pupils, where the loss of Thiago stands out, who could and should have grown into Iniesta's heir. Still, it's not like all these insane decisions were made just because the people in charge didn't know what they were doing. In fact, the truth is much darker. Bartomeu's approach wasn't clueless, it was calculated and cynical. Clearly, his predecessor's strategy had been effective. Remember, when Laporta first took over, Barca wasn't even in Europe's top 10 for club revenue. But under him, that income more than doubled. Then Rosell picked up the torch with a sharper focus on business, and by 2019, Barca wasn't just making bank. They were the top earning club in the world. And when you throw transfer money into the mix, they became the first club in history to come this close to pulling in 1 billion euros in one season. Spoiler, the first club to actually hit that milestone was Real Madrid last year. With all that cash coming in, Bartomeu wasn't too stressed about the expenses or balancing the books. His term was limited, 6 years, and the charter didn't require him to fix any long-term problems. The debt? That'd be someone else's issue down the line. His mindset was, let it burn after I'm gone. But here's where it backfired. In football, like in business, debt comes in 2 flavors, short-term and long-term. Long-term debt isn't always bad. It lets you plan big, grow steadily, and move forward, especially when you've got the kind of revenue Barca had at the time. Short-term debt, though, that's a problem. When those quick pay deadlines start piling up, things can spiral fast. By the middle of Bartomeu's presidency, debt was growing steadily, even with those monster transfer windows. The real red flag was the shift in the debt structure. More and more of it was turning short-term, mostly made up of delayed payments from past transfers. And even as that pressure built, the board shrugged it off. Bartomeu was too focused on his big vision and the bright future, with a consistent increase in revenue. But what Josep didn't count on, and honestly couldn't have, was what came next. In March 2020, everything fell apart. La Liga shut down, club revenues collapsed, creditors got nervous, and Barcelona was suddenly staring down on technical bankruptcy, where cash flow gets so low you can't even cover interest payments on your debt and short-term liabilities. However, an audit later revealed that Barca actually lost no more than 150 million euros due to COVID. Bartomeu, however, blamed the pandemic for way more. Instead of smashing through the 1 billion euro revenue mark as planned, Barcelona's income dropped 15%, landing at 850 million euros. And that dip triggered even bigger problems. If the UEFA Financial Fair Play rules relate only to club losses and the budget framework for compliance with the regulations consists of 3 consecutive seasons, then in the La Liga there is a much stricter salary limit, which affects the activities of clubs literally in the perspective of one season. Each club has a salary cap recalculated every 6 months based on the team's income, expenses, and expected debt payments. And because Barca's income dropped while short-term debts grew, they went into the summer window 300 million euros over the cap. That meant one thing: if they didn't fix it before the new season, they wouldn't be allowed to register new signings. Cue the fire sale. Actually, more like a giveaway. Other clubs saw Barca's desperation and pushed hard for bargain deals, knowing the Catalans had no leverage. Big-name players left for pennies or even for free. The club also worked out temporary pay cuts and bonus deferrals with the squad, saving nearly 50 million euros. On top of that, they got creative with the accounting, like the swap deal between Arthur and Pjanic, which I talked about in one of my last videos. Technically, it was a simple exchange with a small payment from Juventus, but the amortization trick is that all the incoming amounts from sales are recorded in the annual accounts, and the purchase amount is divided by the term of the contracts. The deal was timed to close just before the end of the financial year, helping to clean up the books. Even with all these moves, Barca couldn't meet the salary cap in time, so that summer of 2020 marked the start of a new era in the club life: transfer windows with strict La Liga restrictions. Nevertheless, Barca closed the financial statements for the 1920 season with a loss of less than 100 million euros, which at that time looked almost like a victory. Back then, no one even imagined what kind of reporting disaster would happen just a year later. Koeman, who led the team, showed the worst results since Rijkaard, finishing only 3rd. Barcelona was bypassed not only by Real, but also by the gold-winning Atletico, led by 34-year-old Suarez, the same guy Barca had dumped in brutal fashion just months earlier. But beyond that, the Catalans kept up their 4-year streak of brutal Champions League exits, and this time they got knocked out by the very player they rejected back in 2017. However, by that time, Bartomeu was long out of the game. He also didn't witness the record-breaking 481 million euro loss the club posted at the end of that season. But the thing that brought him down wasn't just the bad transfers, shady agent deals, or financial juggling. As it usually happens in life, everything comes down to small things. Bartomeu's presidential term was set to end in the summer of 2021, and because his short time replacing Rosell also counted toward the 2-term limit, Josep wasn't allowed to run again. So back in 2020, he picked a successor, someone he hoped would carry on his legacy and protect his influence even after stepping down. Now you might think this would be some kind of bold political move, a clever strategy that would shake things up and win support for his team. But nope, it was a classic Barca move. He simply put forward his longtime vice president, the same guy who had been by his side since 2015. And here's where things took a wild turn, but not from Bartomeu himself. The unexpected twist actually came from his hand-picked successor, Émilie Rousseau. Early in 2020, with the club already in chaos, Valverde fired, the locker room divided, and players upset over pay cuts, a bombshell dropped. A top Catalan radio station published an investigation revealing that the club had been paying a PR company to secretly clean up Bartomeu's public image on social media while discrediting his political opponents, famous critics, and even the club's own star players. The narrative was straightforward: shift all the blame onto the players, while the board played the role of heroes trying to save the club from disaster. Josep paid over 1 million euros for this shady PR work, but split it into small invoices to dodge board approval. It was total backdoor play. Just a few hours after the report dropped, Bartomeu Bartomeu called a press conference. He flat out denied everything and even threatened to sue the media outlets behind the investigation. The very next day, Barca cut ties with the PR company that got exposed, though in the official statement they claimed the firm was only hired to monitor social media sentiment and that the contract was cancelled simply because the results were underwhelming. Classic damage control. To make it all look more legit, Bartomeu brought in an outside audit team to run an internal review, basically hoping it would clear his name and make it look like the whole thing was just a smear campaign. But the real audience he was trying to convince wasn't the media, it was the fans. Because for them, this whole Barcagate mess was the final straw. Over the next couple of months, several top execs resigned from their positions, not wanting anything more to do with Bartomeu's regime. Many of them jumped ship and joined the group preparing an impeachment vote against him. And then things got even worse. A fan group called Dignitat Blaugrana filed a complaint with the public prosecutor, opening the door to possible criminal charges. Just think about it. Bartomeu had survived years of sketchy transfers, overpayments, shady business deals, suspicious company ties, and conflicts of interest with his other businesses. All that time, no serious legal fire. But in the end, he managed to blow himself up over a shady troll factory and a measly €1 million contract. What a way to go down. While all this chaos was unfolding, Bartomeu had basically lost interest in football, the team, and everything else. His only goal now was to cling to power until the end of his term. Paranoia started to creep in. He became obsessed with finding out who leaked the Barcagate story, and soon he zeroed in on his own chosen successor. Josep had been grooming vice president for months to take over the club after him, but now he saw him as a traitor. So he fired Rousseau over the phone. The next day, a former ally fired back, doubling down on the corruption claims and fueling the controversy even further. Nevertheless, Bartomeu still survived the summer, during which, by the way, he persuaded Messi to stay at the club. I will return to this critical detail in just a couple of minutes because the way he pulled it off was wild. If Messi had left during all that chaos, fans would have probably stormed the club offices, but that moment was only a pause in the meltdown. By September, over 20,000 socios had signed off on a motion of no confidence. Bartomeu knew he was done. No way to survive it. So he stepped down. It didn't save him from the police raids or the arrests or the lawsuits, many of which are still dragging on. But stepping aside gave the club a bit of breathing room, a chance to reset and finally face the mountain of problems that had built up. The interim board had 6 months to get things in order before the next election, and right away, they kicked off a massive audit of the Bartomeu era. That's when everything really came to light. Overpriced transfers, the same shady agents popping up in multiple deals, and a long list of sketchy financial moves. It got so bad that, for the first time since the Núñez era, people actually started talking about changing Barca's ownership model. Some auditors believed the only way out of the financial hole was to turn the club into a joint stock company and start selling shares to investors. March 7th, the socios head to the polls to make what might be the most crucial choice in Barca's modern history. 3 names are on the ballot, but the outcome is obvious. Joan Laporta wins in a landslide, pulling 55% of the vote. After a run in Catalan politics and a few business ventures, he's back in charge. Just like 18 years ago when he took over from Gaspart, Laporta is stepping in to clean up a mess, rebuilding a broken atmosphere, tackling financial chaos, and putting Barca back on the path to winning and stability. And despite a tough year, the club leaves in high spirits in the offseason as Laporta announces that he has reached an oral agreement on Messi's new contract, according to which Leo is ready for a significant salary reduction to stay at the club. Exactly 1 year ago, after a mess of scandals, the sale of key players, and ugly breakups with friends, Messi had enough. He also wanted out. He sent the club an official notice that he was terminating his contract, citing a clause that let him leave for free at the end of the season. Moreover, Leo believed that his departure could benefit the club, seriously reducing the financial burden. But Bartomeu blocked it. He claimed the clause had expired and stated that Messi would need to pay €700 million if he wanted to leave. And this amount, by the way, would solve many of today's Barca's problems. Tensions exploded. The situation got so bad, Bartomeu even used Messi's potential exit as a political weapon, basically blackmailing him with the idea that he'd step down if Messi stayed. In the end, Leo chose not to make things worse. He said he'd play out his deal because he wasn't ready to drag the club he loved through the courts. 6 months later, everything had changed. Bartomeu was gone, the dust was starting to settle, and Leo was ready to stay. Laporta enters the summer full of hope, thinking he's about to rebuild. But what he doesn't realize is that in July, when the books officially close for the fiscal year, he's about to walk straight into disaster. There was a verbal agreement between Messi and Laporta, but then La Liga, Spanish law, and another financial disaster intervened. After losing 15% of its revenue the year before, Barca took another hit, down 26% by the end of the 2020-21 season. And to make matters worse, the budget was based on earning 200 million euros more than they actually brought in. On top of that, they set a record in club history by blowing past 1 billion euros in total expenses. That combo triggered a fresh wave of salary cap restrictions. Laporta's spring deal with Messi only worked under the old financial numbers. Under the new ones, even cutting Leo's salary in half still wasn't enough to squeeze under the cap. And Spanish law didn't allow them to go any lower, not even temporarily, so there was no legal trick or clever loophole to make it work. Just 1 week after Messi's emotional goodbye, Bartomeu popped back up. Even while under investigation, he dropped an open letter to Laporta. In it, he attempted to defend his own tenure and even blamed his successor for Messi's departure. According to Bartomeu, it was Laporta's poor planning that pushed Leo out, and that if he were still president, he would have found a way to keep him, just like he did a year earlier. Honestly, it's hard to say what Bartomeu was trying to accomplish with that letter. His reputation was already in the mud. If this was his idea of damage control, it completely backfired. All it did was light another fire under his already crumbling legacy. But one thing he definitely managed to do was get under Laporta's skin. The old new president was so fired up by that nerve that just a week after Messi's farewell, he called another press conference, and this time he dropped the whole truth. Barcelona had lost over 500 million euros in just 2 seasons. The club's total debt had reached 1.3 billion euros. And the worst part, 2/3 of that debt was short-term. That means the clock was ticking. If creditors didn't cut them some slack, Barca was heading straight toward technical bankruptcy. That press conference became a turning point. It was raw, brutally honest, and maybe the most open speech ever given by a top football exec, full of real numbers, real problems, and the harsh reality of what was going on behind the scenes at one of the biggest clubs in the world. In that same letter, Bartomeu also accused Laporta of doing nothing while the club was falling apart financially. What he didn't know was that Laporta and his team were already working around the clock on a massive debt restructuring plan. Through endless talks, legal maneuvers, renegotiated terms, and interest rate adjustments, the new management began shifting Barcelona's short-term debts into long-term ones. That gave the club just enough breathing room to pay off overdue wages and build up some cash reserves so they wouldn't end up staring into an empty vault again. And that wasn't all. Behind the scenes, Laporta was preparing a massive plan to pull Barca out of the crisis once and for all. But first, they had to deal with Messi's exit and get the team ready for the new season. Even after Koeman's rough year, Laporta publicly backed him, saying all of Catalonia still trusted their coach. Nevertheless, the president was lying because he had already been negotiating with Xavi that summer. Still, switching managers mid-crisis would have created more financial problems. Koeman's contract included a substantial buyout clause, and registering a new coach would also have affected the league's salary limits. So Laporta put that plan on hold and shifted focus to the summer transfer window. Don't forget, Barca still couldn't spend money like before. Or rather, they could spend it, but they wouldn't be able to register any new signings because they were way over the Liga cap. That's why they focused on selling players. years and brought in nearly 100 million euros from transfers. Still, the squad clearly needed help after such a tough year, so Barca hit the free agent market hard and managed to bring in some key reinforcements for the attack without spending on transfer fees. Nevertheless, in October, Laporta decided to play back his decision and still find loopholes to invite a new coach. Koeman was fired after the 10th round of the championship when the team was stuck in the middle of the table. The club managed to negotiate a slight reduction in his penalty fee, and Xavi returned to Catalonia. And right at that moment, something historic goes down at Camp Nou. Thousands of socios and other important club figures gather for a big meeting. This is where Laporta finally rolls out his master plan to pull the club out of the crisis. He kicks things off with a bold line: "We are here to save Barca." First, he breaks down the budget for the upcoming season. With the pandemic winding down, they're expecting around 20% growth in revenue. And looking ahead, that prediction almost hits the mark. 1 year later, the club pulls in about 750 million euros. Then he shares plans to cut down the record-breaking expenses, which were supposed to drop by over 350 million euros. That didn't fully happen, but still, Barca managed to shave off nearly 300 million euros. Messi's exit definitely played a role in that. Once everyone is caught up on the numbers, Laporta drops the big reveal: his strategy to fix Barca's finances. But instead of lowering the club's massive debt, he suggests adding to it by another 1.5 billion euros. That cash would go into the Espai Barca project, a full revamp of Camp Nou, and a brand new stadium for Barca's basketball and handball teams. The old arena, built back in the 50s and barely updated since, was way past its prime by the 2010s. Funny enough, this wasn't Laporta's idea. The original Espai Barca plan actually came from Bartomeu. Back then, the project was only expected to cost 600 million euros. And unlike Laporta's plan, most of that money wasn't even supposed to come from loans. It would be covered by the club's own funds and future sponsorship deals, including naming rights. But there's one more, much bigger twist coming. Back when Bartomeu pitched this stadium project, he actually did something pretty rare. He called for a whole referendum, first time in 50 years. At that time, Barca's finances were solid. The total debt wasn't even over 300 million euros, and most of it was long-term stuff. The city still had to approve everything, so the plan dragged on for a while, then got delayed and even more expensive thanks to the pandemic. Eventually, it all landed on Laporta's desk. However, instead of seeking approval from the entire club membership, Laporta kept the vote close. Just a small group of high-profile socios, most of whom were loyal to the current board, and that didn't sit well with regular members. Sure, most fans wanted the stadium fixed up, but what frustrated people even more was the payment structure. Laporta's plan pushed the massive loan repayments down the road, starting only once the new stadium was up and running. According to the board, the updated Camp Nou will generate nearly 2.5 times more revenue. If that works out, Barca could become the biggest matchday earner in the world, passing Madrid by almost 100 million euros. And speaking of Los Blancos, just look at their numbers. After reopening the upgraded Santiago Bernabeu last season, their matchday revenue more than doubled. Bigger crowds, better VIP lounges, pricier tickets, it all added up and pushed them to the top of the global matchday charts. Barca's hoping to do the same by the 26-27 season, when they plan to move back into Camp Nou. Drop a comment below. Do you think they'll actually hit those ambitious revenue goals? And now, let's rewind to that same club assembly, because there was one more huge topic on the agenda. Laporta's team kept working hard to restructure the club's massive debt, but even that wasn't enough. They needed more cash, fast, so the board proposed selling a minority stake in Barca Studios, the club's media branch. That deal alone would bring in another 50 million euros. On top of that, Laporta rolled out a list of updates to the club's official rules. Some of these were about modernizing things, such as allowing socios to register online, reducing the presidential term from 6 years to 5, and establishing an ethics and transparency commission. But one small change tucked at the end of the list stood out: Article 67. This article of the Barca Charter states that if a club records losses for 2 consecutive financial years, the management is obliged to compensate for these losses over the next 2 seasons. If this does not happen, it becomes the basis for the early automatic dissolution of the board of directors and the appointment of an interim management administration. It's clear that a discount was made on the pandemic and the troubled past of the leadership, which left a similar legacy, so that during the assembly, Article 67 was temporarily suspended, which gives us an understanding that the club's charter may well be flexible when required by the situation. And I'll come back to that later in the next chapter. After laying out his whole recovery plan, Laporta puts everything up for a vote. He reminds everyone just how bad things got under Bartomeu and how the audit even raised the possibility of changing Barca's ownership model. Laporta says he is fully committed to keeping the club member-owned, but he cannot do it alone. He needs support. He walks off stage, the crowd holds its breath, and just like that, the voting kicks off. And this, folks, is where we finally hit the most crucial chapter of this entire saga. Hold my beer, Pep, his former boss says, and pretty much every other Barca president from different eras. The fact is that as a coach, your activities are limited only to the pitch, but when you're a democratically elected president of a global football beast like Barca, a club that lives off public opinion and has to balance on the edge of dozens of different factors daily, that's not just a different level of responsibility, that's a whole different universe. By now, you've probably decided who's the villain and who's the hero in this story. Who's to blame and who tried to save the club? But what if I tell you that everything is not so clear here? Yes, Bartomeu's style and decisions were a major reason for the club's collapse, and it's easy to point fingers at him as the guy who wrecked everything. However, the fact remains that the trend towards increasing costs, salaries, and transfers in the race for results began during Laporta's first term. It was right before Pep's debut season as head coach, right after Laporta barely survived a vote of no confidence. Once the club tasted victory, that pure Catalan identity wasn't enough. People wanted more. They wanted dominance. And to keep winning, Barca had to compete with new powerhouses, not just on the field, but in the market too. They had to offer bigger contracts, join the salary wars, even for their own academy kids, build influence, make moves in boardrooms, expand into new markets, and play ball with banks and investors. The football world has changed forever. There was a time when a club like Barcelona could stay on top just by earning more than everyone else. But those days are gone. Today, clubs backed by entire nations, some of the wealthiest regimes on the planet, have changed the game, and more of them keep jumping in. Now, pure income isn't enough to stay at the very top. If you're not getting outside money, you're falling behind because outside investment will always outpace what you can earn, no matter how big your club is. And here's the kicker. That investment doesn't even need to be connected to spending. If you want to grow your income, you've got to spend big first. You want to win trophies and cash in on prize money and broadcast deals, you've got to build a stronger squad. You want to boost your matchday income? You've got to spend on your stadium. Want new fans and sponsors? Then you've got to invest in branding and media to reach new markets. It takes time. But one massive check from an outside investor, that changes everything in one signature. But Barca doesn't have that option on the table. Outside funding isn't allowed under the club's traditional structure. And as noble as that sounds, it's often just used as a slogan, something candidates shout during elections to win support. Every campaign, every candidate promises the same thing. We'll protect the fans' voice. We'll make sure the socios stay at the center of everything. Laporta built his first campaign around that idea, and 18 years later, he used the same message to come back. Even Rosell leaned on that message right before he signed the Qatar deal, the first time Barcelona ever had a commercial sponsor on the front of their shirt. But on the other hand, nothing new. This is big-time politics. And when have politicians ever told the truth instead of just saying what the voters want to hear? The issue is that by electing a popularly elected president who de facto becomes the owner of the club and has considerable freedom in terms of decision-making, including abandoning his election promises, outright lies, and policy changes, the club does not get the opportunity to develop and exist as a typical commercial organization, according to all market laws, with the attraction of investments and all the economic advantages. In other words, we get a kind of unfinished hybrid when the club itself seems to be a commercial structure with a main person who determines the vector of development, controls personnel policy, transfer campaigns, sponsors, and so on, but which, unlike competitors, still lacks the most essential advantages of such a model. And this setup keeps Barca stuck behind the competition. By the way, I'm planning a full video this summer that breaks down the different football ownership models around the world. We'll look at how things work in England with full private ownership ownership, Germany with the 50+1 rule, and even the totally unique setup in the US. But maybe the most obvious contrast to Barca is what's been happening in Manchester. Let me be clear, what the Glazers did at the start, buying United with borrowed money and pushing that debt onto the club, was nothing short of criminal. I talked a lot about it in my video on United's takeover. But putting that part aside, what came after, the club going public, bringing in outside investors, and finding new funding sources, is standard practice in the business world, and honestly, it's one of the only reliable ways clubs can keep their budgets running in today's football economy. Is it worse than taking out new loans or selling your non-existent income in the future to cover your current expenses, depriving yourself of a piece of your future, but justifying this by adhering to the traditional management model? This is probably a rhetorical question, but we'll get into all those risky moves, Laporta's famous levers, in the final chapter. And by the way, United, even as a joint stock company in the late 90s, had fan representation on the board of directors in the form of an entire trust, which influenced the club's activities perhaps even more than socios in the Barcelona system. And another catch is that the mood of the masses is still changeable, and therefore, for example, in 2015, Laporta's familiar Catalan rhetoric lost to Bartomeu's more pragmatic approach. People just wanted something different at the time. But if we stop looking through the lens of catchy slogans and take a hard look at how this club has actually been run, how much has this management model really protected that Catalan identity during the reign of various presidents? Is there still a real appetite for it among the club's members, after years of broken promises, manipulation, and political games? Well, another important issue is that with all this democratic system, Barcelona has been at the mercy of a limited circle of people for more than 40 years. They simply replace each other, exploiting loopholes in the regulations or flat out ignoring them when needed. There is no room for random people, no new ideas, no fresh vision that could actually push the club forward. So at the end of the day, was this fight for democracy really worth it? Right now, as you're watching this video, Barcelona has already wrapped up the league title, picked up the Spanish Cup, and came just one step short of reaching the Champions League final. By the end of May, it'll mark exactly 10 years since Barca's last appearance in the final back in Berlin. During that decade, their biggest rival lifted the Champions League trophy 4 times, and the key detail is that Real actually exists in the same management paradigm. The club also belongs to its socios, but unlike Barca, there's no illusion of full-on democracy in Madrid. Back in the early 2010s, the ruling party seriously shook up the existing model, limiting democratic processes and ensuring club leadership stability. New, much stricter requirements for presidential candidates were introduced, as well as a narrowing of the group of voting socios who make crucial decisions. This frees the club from unnecessary bureaucracy, allows it to act and make decisions more quickly, and besides, it certainly gives Perez support, because most of the compromisarios are loyal to the ruling party. As a result, Florentino has outlasted 3 different Barca presidents, and he might outlast 3 more. Last January, he was re-elected for another 4-year term, and again, like all previous times after the club's charter was updated, he was the only candidate in the election due to strict selection filters. Of course, you will object to all this. Absolute dictatorship, and you wouldn't be wrong. But that modernized, authoritarian democratic system has delivered something that can't be ignored. Los Blancos has been the most successful football club of the decade, and the most financially stable. They were also the first to plan and launch a complete stadium renovation, setting the trend for others to follow. And this happened while Madrid was often making less money than their rivals from Catalonia. Still, they kept spending on transfers like any other top club in Europe. Meanwhile, Barca was drowning in record debt, and Madrid was calmly reporting an unused credit line worth nearly 400 million euros. So maybe the issue isn't just Bartomeu's failed transfers or the idea that one man alone wrecked a legendary club with bad decisions. Maybe it's more about the structure. Perez doesn't need to worry about how to win elections, how to keep the socios happy, or how to hand off power to a chosen successor. He's built a system where he's focused on what matters right now, because he'll be the one dealing with the consequences later. Sure, Perez and his circle have made massive profits through their construction business, all while being connected to the Los Blancos brand. He's even sued investigative journalists who claimed Real's transfer dealings helped land contracts around the world. But that's exactly the kind of scale we're talking about here. This isn't about sketchy deals or inflated agent fees. This isn't about stashing money in side pockets. That stuff's small small time for a guy who's been running the show for over 15 years, and most of the socios in Madrid seem okay with it. Hard to argue, considering the club's incredible run of success over the past decade. Yeah, there's an opposition. They periodically show up during the bad times, but the conservative core of the fan base still holds power. Now, something like that would never fly in Catalonia. This is a region with centuries of fighting for independence, deeply rooted in democracy. But even here, when things get rough and survival's on the line, even a club like Barca might have to borrow a page or two from the authoritarian playbook. Financially, Barcelona still has a long way to go. The club keeps getting dragged into new scandals and is still cleaning up the mess from old ones. But even with all that, the results on the pitch, and most importantly, the style of football, have started to turn around. It's already clear that Laporta's risky strategy is starting to pay off. In 23, the team finally won La Liga and the Spanish Super Cup after 4 dry seasons. And while Xavi's more cautious style left some fans unsure a couple of years ago, this season under Hansi Flick is a whole different story. His bold attacking football feels like a return to the classic Barca way, and in a few years, this could be seen as the start of something really big. Laporta's strategy to overcome the crisis turned out to be much more risky than it initially seemed. He didn't just take out a loan to rebuild the stadium. When the president couldn't agree on pay cuts with some players and had to part ways with a few longtime veterans in the summer of 22, he went all in. Barca had its biggest transfer window since Griezmann. To make that happen, the club had to get creative. Laporta used what he called levers, selling off pieces of the club's future income just to get cash in the short term. Laporta's been clear since the day he came back. He had 2 options. He could freeze spending, tighten the belt, and wait for the finances to recover slowly. But that would mean Barca falling even further behind the top clubs. So instead, he chose to double down, keep investing, grow faster, and try to power through the crisis with scale and momentum. By the summer of 2022, Barca had sold off nearly 700 million euros of its future income just to stay afloat. And even after that, the club still struggled to register its new signings. Things got so tight that Laporta had to put in some of his own money just to register Jules Koundé, because La Liga wasn't giving an inch on its financial rules. But in the end, those risky moves paid off. The team went on to win La Liga that season, and maybe even more important than the trophy, Laporta's decisions helped set the stage for a whole new chapter, one that's full of promise. After all the chaos of the last 4 or 5 years, Barca was finally going back to its roots. Back to La Masia, the legendary academy that built the most successful era in club history. Under Flick, the young players are getting real minutes and making a serious impact. In fact, during the first half of the season, Barca ranked among the top 3 clubs across Europe's top leagues when it came to homegrown players. Almost half the team's total playing time was handled by La Masia grads. The team is planning to return to Camp Nou next season. The stadium won't be finished yet, but they'll be back playing at home, even if it's with limited capacity while the final work wraps up. Full completion is expected by the summer of 2026, and once the stadium is fully open, Barca will finally begin chasing its goal of leading the world in matchday revenue. That's also when the loan repayments kick in. New elections are coming in the same year, and Laporta has already said he and his team will be running. Despite some clashes with fan groups and the usual criticism from the opposition, most club members support the way he's been leading Barca out of the crisis. Of course, people still bring up the whole selling the future thing from time to time, but with no strong rivals in sight, and considering how this season's going, something wild would have to happen for Laporta not to secure a 4th term. And honestly, that could be the perfect setup. This young, exciting team has all the tools to grow into a true dynasty. As they gain experience and the club slowly chips away at its debt, Barca might just become the most fascinating story in today's football industry. So yeah, keep your eyes on Catalonia. Visca el Barça!